Hello and welcome back to Solomon's Cave. It has been a while since my last video, because I'm in the middle of moving to another continent, but I'm glad to present you this next Bible-oriented video about the Pentateuch, also known as the Torah. I'll talk about what the Pentateuch is, how it functions, and finally the meaning of the Pentateuch. So let's start with what the Pentateuch is. You may have recognized the word penta. You see it in pentagram, which is a 5-pointed star, or a pentagon, a 5-sided building in the United States. So it should come as no surprise that penta means 5. So it is the 5 teuchs. What is teuch? Well, we don't really know, but we do know it refers to the 5 books that make up the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, or in Hebrew, Bereshit, Ve'eleh Shemoth, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Ele Hadavarim. Oh, we're speaking Hebrew now? Then I might as well explain what Torah means. The dictionary definition of Torah is law, but it can also be understood as guidance or instruction. Now the Torah, or the Pentateuch, is the first part of every Bible, be it a Christian Bible or a Jewish Bible. And though the order of the books later in the Bible differs somewhat, up to this point, Jewish and Christian Bibles are identical. But even though in both cases the Pentateuch or the Torah is at the beginning of the Bible, their function is somewhat different. And though Pentateuch and Torah mean the same thing, and I often use them interchangeably, in this section I will try to call it Pentateuch when discussing its role in the Christian canon, and I will try to refer to it as Torah when discussing the Jewish canon. So let's talk about how the Pentateuch functions in Christian canons. The Pentateuch is the first of 4 blocks of books, followed by the New Testament. For Christians, the idea is relatively simple. After Deuteronomy, you start with history, since that is what they take away from the Pentateuch. It begins the history with creation, and then through the patriarchs, Moses and the Exodus, it ends at the border of the land. Then Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, and Kings continue that history. Chronicles repeats it, and then Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther complete it. And then it is time for reflection on the present, with a section of poetic wisdom books. And finally, a look towards the future, with the prophetic books. And then, at the end of Malachi, there is a messianic prophecy, which opens the door to the New Testament. And when we take a quick look at the New Testament, we see a similar build-up, with the Gospels and Acts discussing past events, namely the life of Jesus and the early church, followed by the present, the letters instructing the church on how to live today, and finally the book of Revelation talking about the future. So the primary function of the Pentateuch in the Christian Bible is to set forth a historical perspective of God beginning to reveal himself to his people, which ultimately culminates in Jesus of Nazareth as the ultimate revelation of God. Now the Jewish canon has a different setup. For though it starts with the Torah, it then continues with the prophetic books, called the Nevi'im, namely Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Hey, wait a minute, weren't those historical books? Well, they can be, and they certainly cover a lot of history. But what is more important, describing past events, or evaluating and interpreting past events? Historians would agree that no description of the past is completely void of evaluation or interpretation. Not that it is only evaluation and interpretation, but whether it's the selection of the topic, the selection of which materials to include and which to leave out, the order in which the material is to be presented, and decisions on how much text is to be spent on which events, all of these are part of a subjective interpretation of past events. Anyway, these historical books are seen as the early prophets, because it is the interpretation, the prophetic interpretation of history that is important. They are then followed by the later prophets, or the writing prophets. And then the third part of the Hebrew Bible were the writings, or the ketuvim. This is basically whatever else. This includes historical books like Ruth and Chronicles, wisdom or poetic books like the Psalms and Ecclesiastes, and of course the prophetic-ish book of Daniel. Now, all these books are considered canonical, or sacred, by all Jewish denominations. Yet in practice, the Torah receives by far the most attention. Several Jewish denominations have the habit to read a part of the Torah every Shabbat in the synagogue, often reading from beginning to end in a 1-year cycle or a 3-year cycle. Together, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, that is, the law, the prophets, and the writings, form the Tanakh. That's a nice little acronym for you. So there you see the difference. In the Christian tradition, the Pentateuch stands at the beginning of a journey, going from the past, through the present, into the future. While in Judaism, the Torah is at the center and everything else circles around it. Now personally, I think the Torah can be used in both of those ways. It can very well function as the beginning of a journey, and it can function as the center of attention. A beginning because history clearly continued after Moses' death, and there is also an internal progression of events. At the same time, I can see that no single major theological theme that is developed later in the Bible, either in the rest of the Old Testament or in the New Testament, does not have its roots in the first 5 books. So perhaps, in order to do justice to both legitimate uses of the Torah or the Pentateuch, you could also argue that the Torah or the Pentateuch is a foundation for the rest of Scripture and theology. So this is how the Torah or the Pentateuch is used and can be used. As for the content or the meaning, I would want to focus on 3 main points. First of all, I want to look at the law aspect of the Torah. Then I want to look at the historical function of the Pentateuch. And finally, I want to look at what could be perhaps the most important theological notion in the Pentateuch, namely the idea of the covenant. Regarding the laws that are found in the Torah, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. As we have seen, a large number of laws and regulations relate to the cult, either directly, for example, regarding the construction of the tabernacle and the bringing of sacrifices, or indirectly, for example, the regulations regarding clean and unclean and how to live holy lives. Now, the function of the cult is to reinforce or affirm the covenant relationship between God and the covenant people. So these rules exist to support the covenant and govern how the covenant people are to interact with God. Another set of rules that occasionally overlaps with the previous set consists of the rules that govern the organization of the covenant community. This includes laws like don't murder and don't steal, and occasionally spelling out punishments for certain transgressions. This sometimes spills over into what might be called a primitive political theory, or perhaps a very rough draft of a constitution, like allowing the Israelites to choose a king. And the final set of rules that I want to focus on are the so-called group identity markers. These are rules and regulations that can be part of either of the 2 previously mentioned groups, but they also have a function of explicitly showing that they belong to the covenant community. The first and most famous example is that of circumcision. Another example is the celebration of the Shabbat, or one could point to certain hair and clothing requirements, like that they should have little brushes on the corners of their clothes, or that they should not shave the 4 corners of their beards. Now, this is not to say that these categories are explicitly mentioned in the text, or that certain laws cannot be in more than one category, but it does show that the main purpose of these laws is to organize various relationships. The relationship between God and the covenant community, the relationship among the people of the covenant community, and the relationship between the covenant community and the people of the other nations. Moving to the realm of history. The Pentateuch clearly describes a lot of events that can be classified as history. Obviously, Genesis covers a lot of history, from the creation of the world to the death of Joseph in Egypt. But the event of the Exodus is clearly central. In fact, the story of the Exodus is in many ways the most important event in the history of Israel. No other event in Israel's past is referenced as often as this. It is referenced all over the historical books, the prophetic books, and the poetic books. And the centrality of the Exodus continues in the New Testament as well. And these can take the forms of references, retellings, or moments where the Exodus story becomes a model by which to describe more recent historical events, like the Babylonian exile. In this way, Exodus becomes a key narrative about Israel's national identity. Think of it as a parallel to the American War for Independence, and how it shapes the way the people of the United States see themselves. Similarly, for the Netherlands, it is our own 80 years war against the Spanish for independence that shaped this country. And if you're English, the Battle of Hastings fulfills a similar function. And for many Central American countries, it was Francisco Morazan's campaign, while it is Simón Bolívar and his campaign that fulfills that same role for the northern part of South America. And those are all the countries I know enough about to identify a key moment in their national history. And every defining moment in a country's history comes with a hero. For the United States it is George Washington. For the Netherlands, Willem van Oranje. For England, of course, we have William the Conqueror. And then, of course, I already mentioned Francisco Morazán and Simón Bolívar for the Latin American regions. Now for Israel, the human hero is of course clearly Moses, but ultimately it is God. In any case, the centrality and importance of this narrative in the Pentateuch and the rest of the Old Testament says a lot about the identity of Israel and how they saw themselves. And most importantly, it saw itself as the beneficiary of the saving act of a merciful and faithful God. And finally, I want to have a quick look at the covenant. I could do a whole series of videos just about the covenant. In fact, I could do an entire YouTube channel dedicated just to covenant theology. But to keep it short and simple, there are roughly 3 types of covenants. There is the covenant between 2 equal partners, like a marriage or a business transaction. There is the covenant between a king and a beneficiary, sometimes called a royal gift covenant. And there is the covenant between a victorious king and a conquered king. For much of the Pentateuch, the second type of covenant is referred to, where God is a king and he gives something for free to Israel. Now there are conditions for maintaining the covenant, but not for obtaining it. And this idea of a royal gift covenant goes back to Abraham, and before that to Noah. And some would argue it can even go back to creation itself. But then later, when Israel rebels against God and his covenant, the tone shifts somewhat to the type of covenant of a conquering king, a type of covenant that even dictated the macrostructure of a book like Deuteronomy. But regardless of the precise type of covenant we are talking about, both the Old and the New Testament constantly refer back to this idea of a covenant. In fact, the word testament itself means covenant, to give you an idea of how dominant this theme is. And this also makes the biblical religions, both Judaism and Christianity, so unique among their contemporaries, because they are covenant religions. For in all other religions, the favor of the gods had to be initially earned. But here, God initiates a relationship with his people and obliges himself to them. And that's it for this video. I hope to be posting another Hebrew video soon, and then somewhere in August I will be able to pick up my normal publishing schedule again. For updates, news and announcements, you can follow me on social media. If you liked this video, let me know in the comments, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel.